It's now time for the sponsor perspective of our program. Please welcome Victoria Mills, Managing Director of the Environmental Defense Fund, in conversation with Jason Jedlinski, Publisher and General Manager of The Hill.
Victoria, thank you for joining us. Thrilled to have you here today.
Delighted to be here, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
So can you start by telling us, why is this an all hands on deck moment for sustainability?
Well, we can't ignore that this conversation is happening as the world faces twin crises, a war in Ukraine and worsening impacts from climate change. And both of these crises are deeply destabilizing. Both of them threaten our national security, our international security, and the global economy. And both of them are linked to the world's dependence on fossil fuels. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, makes clear that the only way to ensure long-term security, peace, and stability is to transition the global economy to clean energy. And the IPCC report also points out the importance of public policy in enabling the transition to a clean energy future.
What are some of the biggest opportunities you see to make a difference on climate right now?
So right now, we have a huge opportunity right in front of us in the United States. And that means passing the clean energy investments that Congress is considering as part of the budget bill. So these investments are going to help decarbonize the biggest emitting sectors, electric power and transportation. They include tax credits and investments in clean energy, in EVs and in charging infrastructure, and in advanced manufacturing and resilience to climate impacts. And these investments in the budget reconciliation bill build on the down payment that Congress already made last year with the Infrastructure Investment in Jobs Act, which included a historic $65 billion investment in clean energy transmission and the electric grid. So it's really hard to overstate how important congressional action on climate is right now, and US leadership, to changing the trajectory of global emissions. So according to the IPCC, to avoid catastrophic impacts of climate change, we need to reduce emissions 43% by 2030. That's 8 years. So we don't have a lot of time. And the world can't reach this target without American leadership. And the only way we can credibly lead is with action. So if you think about $550 billion in clean energy transmission, in clean energy investments, that's really going to be transformative. It's going to modernize the economy. It's going to enable the transition to clean power. It's going to provide power for the rapidly growing electric vehicle industry and charging infrastructure, and spur massive innovation across the economy.
So you've mentioned the need for American leadership and what you're looking for from Congress. Tell us about the role you see for businesses in accelerating the transition to net zero.
So I think about it this way. We have no time to waste. And so I think the question for all of us is no longer what can we do to address climate change, but what will it take to limit catastrophic impacts? And so I think that's the frame through which all of us, including businesses, need to look at it. So for businesses getting more concrete, the answer is twofold. First, they need to dramatically reduce their own emissions, as many of them are committing to do. And second, they need to vigorously advocate for climate policy. Because while voluntary actions and commitments to reduce emissions are important, they're only a first step, and they will never add up to enough emission reductions to bend the emissions curve downward. And that's why you need public policy to deliver emission reductions at the speed and scale needed to avoid catastrophic impacts. Businesses do have the power to shape public policy. They have no hesitation to lobby energetically in their interest. And we're just saying they need to use that same power to address climate change and lobby for climate policy. In fact, I would argue the most powerful tool they have to fight climate change is their political influence.
We hear a lot of companies talking about sustainability as a key value and initiative. Can you walk us through the business case for climate policy?
Yeah. So, the obvious answer is that policies that reduce emissions and that drive down emissions systems wide have the benefit of reducing the costs and risks associated with the changing climate. In the United States, our economy suffered $742 billion in costs and losses due to extreme weather and climate-related extreme weather events in the last 5 years alone. So policies that reduce emissions necessarily are good for business. Secondly, clear and predictable policies and regulatory stability enables long-term planning, and which is critical for growth and job creation. And efficiency, because businesses don't have the uncertainty of what's going to happen in this administration or that administration. They have that certainty on which to invest. The other thing that's important is that policies that reduce our dependence on oil, whose price is set on the world market, no matter whether it's produced in Russia or Texas, have the benefit of making us less vulnerable to price spikes caused by geopolitical conflict, like we're seeing right now in Ukraine. So the climate and clean energy policies on the table in Congress right now are going to help us control our own energy future.
And what does that look like for a company? Climate change leadership, sort of walk us through what success looks like.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is it just means putting your lobbying muscle behind where your mouth is on climate. And the fact is that companies need those climate policies to meet their own commitments. We've seen scores of companies setting net zero and carbon neutral and 100% renewable energy goals and scope 3 emission reduction goals. They can't get there without policy changes. How are you going to achieve 100% renewable energy without policies that modernize the grid and enable the uptake of significant amounts of clean and renewable energy? How are you going to reduce your scope 3 emissions or transition to a 100% renewable fleet without policies that invest in charging infrastructure and provide incentives for EV purchases? So that's a little bit more of the business case. And I think that's where we're starting to see some more constructive advocacy by businesses.
And Victoria, any final comments you want to leave people watching this summit with today?
I would say that what's expected right now from investors, from employees, from all stakeholders is leadership on climate, that requires policy leadership. And it means making climate a top advocacy priority, just like tax or trade or any other core business issue, and driving it from the C-suite. We've seen examples of that and you can go to EDF's climate authenticity meter to look at companies that are advancing climate policy, and also some unfortunate examples of industry groups that are holding it back. And finally, I would just say, there's so much in the news that is deeply distressing nowadays. And that's why it's so important to seize the opportunities that we have right in front of us to make a difference. And in the coming weeks, we collectively here in the US have the opportunity to put legislation that makes a real dent in climate change on a path to the president's desk. And by working together, businesses and government and civil society can make it happen. So I say, don't get depressed. Let's get busy.
A fitting sentiment. Thank you so much. Victoria Mills, Managing Director of the Environmental Defense Fund. We appreciate your support.
Thank you so much, Jason.